Welcome to the 10-Minute Talks. I suspect that when Michael Sandel talks to us tomorrow, he will tell us that no one deserves to get into Harvard. I won't argue the point, except to say that our lives did not end then and there, and the following 5 speakers are admirable proof of that. None of our speakers sought to be singled out. Only when the reunion committee asked whether they would share their story did each of them very modestly agree. We thank them. Our first speaker is Peter Brooks. Peter lived in Adams House, and after graduation, he moved to UC Berkeley, where he obtained a master's degree in art history. He then embarked on what became a long 2-track career. By day, he served as a nonprofit executive, fundraiser, and advocate on behalf of adults with developmental disabilities and families affected by violence. By night, he served on the faculty of a community college where he taught art history. In 2014, Peter retired, mostly to devote himself to the White Pony Express, a nonprofit which he helped found and which helps relieve hunger in Contra Costa County, California. Peter has entitled his talk, "All of Us Taking Care of All of Us." Peter?
Well, thank you, Charlie, and classmates, for this chance to share my thoughts with you. They follow up on what I put in my written report in the Red Book, which I hope you'll all read if you haven't read it yet. That report ended with the experience of a total stranger, a poor Black man to whom I gave some money, telling me, a privileged white man, "Brother, there is absolutely no difference between you and me because we are all one."
Recording in progress.
We're all one. I believe that what he said is the truth. Now, what do we do about it? I must agree with Darren Walker of the Ford Foundation, who says we have to get past feel-good philanthropy and condescending charity. If we are all one, then sharing our privileged abundance with those who are in serious need is actually a matter of justice. The playing field of life in our time has got to be leveled by those who own or control a surplus. But it's not enough to do it from an altitude and attitude of 30,000 feet. If we're trying to eliminate hunger, it's not enough to pour dollars into mega pounds of food and dump it into sectors on the map designated as low income or needy. Scale is important, but it's not enough, even with a well-oiled system designed by highly qualified thinkers. Being one actually means getting to know the people who need help and understanding what they really need. And to understand someone, as a wise person once said, and I've learned, you have to stand under them with respect. What we come to then is the concept of all of us taking care of all of us. Help that comes through engagement and empathy. What is the consequence if we privileged ones don't embrace this concept? Well, the real loss is not being able to experience the expansion of the heart that comes when we share what we have with someone else. All of us taking care of all of us is actually the tagline of the volunteer-driven organization that has been the center of my life since I retired 7 years ago, White Pony Express. As a food rescue operation, we distribute donated food to about 15,000 meals 364 days a year in our county in the Bay Area, enough to feed 5,000 people 3 meals a day. Most of it is fresh, meats, dairy, produce, and prepared foods. We don't store food like a food bank, but get it out to our network of 80 community partners the same day we receive it. We take the extra step of sorting through the items we pick up from grocery stores and distributors to discard anything that we wouldn't consider good enough to feed our own families. Then we contact our partners to see what their specific needs are on a given day and try to match it up with what we have received before we make the delivery. This personalization will be taken a step further when we launch our new initiative this year, Neighbors Helping Neighbors. In this new program, our volunteers will take requests for specific food items through a mobile app and deliver them free to families in need. It's like Uber or Lyft for hunger relief. White Pony Express goes beyond food. We also distribute donated clothing, much of it new, children's books and toys, and since the pandemic, cash. We've now begun to partner with a group of people who simply give away money to families who need it. WPE volunteers, like me, go up to the door of persons referred to us by their children's school or social service agency and hand them a gift-wrapped box containing $1,000 or more in cash. WPE is looking to expand our impact. Already, we've assisted others to replicate our approach beyond the Bay Area in Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and New Orleans. It hasn't been my intent to make this talk just about White Pony Express. If you'd like to know more about WPE, feel free to contact me. peter@whiteponyexpress.org is that email, or go to the WPE website, whiteponyexpress.org. What I really want to share now is the kinship I've come to feel with people who are homeless or in serious need. My report told you about the time I tried to lift a homeless woman who had fallen on the sidewalk and couldn't get up. Nothing I could do would work. In the end, she had me bring over her shopping cart, replace the heavy items that had spilled out, and then brace it firmly while she used it to pull herself upright. I wrote that story last July. Immediately afterward, I fell in my garden and found that I was unable to get up. I called my wife and she tried to lift me. I'm 6'4", 225 pounds, and had a lot of arthritis. She couldn't do it. We were both desperate. In the end, I took a lesson from my homeless friend with the cart and got Mary to pull some low-hanging branches from a tree within my reach so that I could grab them and hoist myself upright. Thus, I was forced to actually experience the need of someone I had helped and learn from it. The picture, please, first one. Here I am with my friend Don. I first got to know him when I shared my breakfast with him and two other homeless men on a cold December morning. One of them died of exposure, along with another companion, a week later, leaning up against the same fence where you see Don in the picture. That incident sparked the creation of the White Pony Express cold weather clothing program. At the informal gathering for them, where I stood next to Don, our White Pony Express founder, Dr. Carol Weiland Connor, pledged that this would never again happen in our community. Could lose the slide now. Don and I have shared a lot over the last 5 years. For example, our experience with prostate cancer, which began at just the same time. Now we share the exact same PSA count of 0.014. Our Lupron injections have the same effect of making our joints stiff and our walk slower. But we're both better off, and we are grateful. And Don's chemotherapy destroyed his taste for alcohol. So being sober, he became eligible for new supportive housing that was recently built. So now Don has a home. Now, please indulge me while I tell you about our cat, Hurley. She too was homeless. I first saw her as she wandered up a street on the outskirts of Washington, D.C., where we had relatives. She was dirty, her hair was scruffy, she was very thin. Well, not yet, but a previous owner had pulled out her claws and abandoned her, and she was at least 10 years old. We brought her to California and adopted her. The first thing that happened was that she had major surgery. Then she had other expensive medical needs: acupuncture, laser sessions, Chinese herbs, chiropractic, treatment for a weird liver condition, and monthly grooming. The cost came to well over $10,000 in 3 years. Was it worth it? Absolutely. She blossomed, gained weight, and developed a soft and luxuriant coat, but most importantly, she brought love and healing. Her appreciation for a new home and family were expressed through intense purring. Whenever Mary or I would touch her, she immediately purred. Well, this is a picture of Hurley in her favorite nighttime place against my shoulder. This shoulder was arthritic, but within 2 weeks of Hurley's bedtime purring and massage with her clawless paws, the pain went away. When Mary got lymphoma, had 6 months of chemotherapy, Hurley was by her side whenever she was in bed. When I had surgery for kidney cancer, as well as the prostate thing, Hurley curled up and purred on my lap on the couch each evening. We've now achieved remission for all 3 of our cancers. Was it Hurley's doing? Well, maybe not entirely, as we had excellent care covered by excellent insurance that we're privileged to have. But for sure, Hurley healed my torn rotator cuff after that fall in our garden. I couldn't go to physical therapy. So she turned on the purr machine again, and it worked. Why am I telling you about this cat? Well, consider this. She was a scruffy little old homeless creature from the gutter. But we invested in her far more than most people thought reasonable. And look what happened. What a powerful force of joy, companionship, and loving healing she shared with us. We became one with her. If this payoff can happen with a little hard luck animal, how about with our fellow human beings? Think about it, and let's see what we can do. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter. That was excellent. Our second speaker is Polly Cleveland. She lived in North House while at Radcliffe. After graduating, she, I just lost this. After graduating, she began a PhD at Harvard in Near Eastern Studies, but after 3 years switched to UC Berkeley, where she earned a PhD in agricultural and resource economics. Since her dissertation entitled Consequences and Causes of Unequal Distribution of Wealth, she has devoted herself to social justice. Polly writes a blog entitled Economiki. She serves on the board of Dollars and Cents, and until 2016, she was an adjunct professor of economics at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, where she taught a course on poverty, inequality, and the environment. She continues at Columbia as an adjunct senior research scholar. Polly has entitled her talk, Baby Sling, the Invention That Launched a Human Evolution. Polly?
Well, thank you. Thank you. This is not quite about inequality, or maybe about inequality between the sexes. Anyway, I'm inviting you all to a lightning introduction to a mystery that has intrigued me for a long time, which is, how did our ancient ancestors get down from the trees? Slide, please. Next slide. When my daughter was born in 1976, I was in for a big shock. Naked babies are super slippery. I was terrified of dropping her or bruising her by gripping too hard. I bathed her in a little hand laundry tub on the floor. I knew that in all cultures around the world, women carry babies in slings or other devices. So I started to wonder, how far back in history did slings go? How did the original naked ape carry her baby? This is a lovely statue at the Smithsonian in DC. Next slide, please. I found out that primate babies cling to their mom's fur with hands and feet. And that's a chimp with a baby on board. Chimp infants are tiny and scrawny and easy for mom to grasp with one hand. After a month, they begin to cling with hands and feet. Human infants weigh 7 pounds and they can't cling, they never cling. So I started to wonder, did human babies evolve to be carried in slings? Next slide, please. Okay, this is a picture of the extraordinary difference between human and ape feet. You know, apes have hands on their feet. Anyway, where am I now? Fossils show that human ancestors lost the ability to cling with their feet millions of years ago. And you can see from the picture how very different human and ape feet are. In 1976, two young women anthropologists made a radical proposal. They were Nancy Tanner and Adrienne Zillman, and I think they were at UC Santa Cruz. They proposed that early females invented slings to gather food, and then they began using those slings to carry babies. And then once the babies were in slings and didn't have to cling, then feet could evolve for walking. And this proposal has been mostly ignored by anthropologists. Next slide. This is a wonderful picture of Flo. That's Jane Goodall's matriarchal chimp in a chimp tree nest with a baby. That's its the little white spot is its tail, and an older baby. Anyway, as the baby sling hypothesis helps solve the problem of how human ancestors moved from living in trees to living on the ground. If you imagine, without slings, how could females carry non-clinging infants when they climbed and slept in the trees? How could they escape from predators by dashing up a tree? Without slings, how could females forage if their hands were tied up carrying a baby? So next slide. This latest ancestor has totally upended assumptions about human origins. So when and how did the tree to ground transition happen? Human ancestors and chimps separated about 6 million years ago. And this is a picture of what a common ancestor for chimps and humans may have looked like. This little guy, this is a little ape that walked along horizontal tree branches, mostly living in the Mediterranean area in something called laurel forests. In any case, human ancestors were upright. And then when the forests retreated to Africa, chimps started knuckle walking, and our ancestors kept right on walking upright, except they walked on the ground. So it's really, this is just the last 2 years of this research, pretty amazing. Next slide. Okay, now paleo artist Jay Maternus, you probably have unwittingly seen some of his illustrations. He's done some of the big murals at the Smithsonian in DC. In any case, he depicted a female ancestor something over 4 million years ago carrying a baby. Now, by 5 million years ago, feet had become suitable for walking, but still had a separated big toe. And this is Ardipithecus, a complete fossil that was found in the 1990s. And she could walk, but she could also climb trees. And she still had a chimp-sized brain. So anyway, Artie is carrying a large nursing baby on her arm, which strikes me as implausible. A chimp baby that size would already be clinging. So the question again, how could Artie scramble up a tree if a saber-toothed cat came along? So I actually wrote to Maternus asking him about this, and he agreed with me that Artie would need a sling. And it hadn't occurred to him to think about a sling because slings don't fossilize. Next, please. Okay, many of you have probably seen this famous picture again by Maternus of ancestors walking through an ash field from a volcano. And by then, that was 3.6 million years ago, they had completely modern feet, short toes, stiff ankles. And the very famous complete fossil Lucy was about 3.2 million years ago, and she still had a chimp-sized brain. And again, when I looked at this picture a number of years ago, I thought, whoa, is this plausible that a female could carry a 3 or 4 year old child on her hip? I mean, over rough terrain, everybody would get tired. She'd need her hands. It didn't make a whole lot of sense. But anyway, you must have seen this was published in the Geographic in '79. Okay, next slide. Anthropologists, where am I? Yeah, have ignored the baby. Where am I? Yeah, have ignored the baby sling hypothesis because slings don't fossilize. And, they resist hypotheses that challenge conventional wisdom. And our ancestors weren't considered smart enough anyway. I mean, they still had small brains after all. However, chimps, and that's mostly female chimps, do make tools. In fact, they make a lot of tools, mostly the females. Next slide. So this is an amazing recent discovery, a stone working workshop of 3.3 million years ago in Lomekwi, Kenya. And this was a million years before big brains. Our ancestors were fabricating sharp stone tools. Now, making tools needs training. It needs years of practice. And I think these tool makers must have been carrying such heavy, sharp tools in bags or slings. I mean, how could they? And if they did, they must have also been using slings for food, water, and babies. And, this is about as hard evidence as you can get that bags and slings and the like went way, way back, long before big brains. Okay, next slide. Next slide. Yeah. Okay. The problem has been, and this gets me back to inequality and sexism and all of that, is that the accepted paradigm for human evolution is that the guys did everything and took care of their helpless females. Men went out, they made the tools, they did the hunting, they did just about everything while the wife waited back in the cave for him to come home. And this is shown in museums. I have some wonderful pictures from the museum in Washington, D.C. too, but this is the Museum of Natural History down the street from me. And on the right there, that is Lucy. That was the complete 3.3 million year old fossil showing a female with pretty much normal anatomy, but a brain the size of a chimp. And what did the curators do? They put this huge male in with her. They totally invented him. And she's looking sort of nervously to the side, and he's got his reassuring arm around her shoulders. So this is what you will see in museums. And this is why it is so hard for hypotheses involving females to break through. So, I've said time to bring Me Too into anthropology. This is my lovely 6-year-old granddaughter, Casey, who already wants to be a biologist when she grows up. I mean, she collects animals. She can tell you the names of every dinosaur that ever lived. And of course, she's having a wonderful time there at the museum. Next slide. Just wanted to thank, I've been talking to a number of anthropologists. I wanted to thank them. That's Sarah Blaffer-Hurdy, Jeremy De Silva, who did some of the pictures I had, Pearl Capps, old friend, and Richard Milner, an authority on Darwin. And I'd like to thank all of you very much for listening in. I don't know how I've done on time, but that's a big dose of paleoanthropology. Thank you.
Thank you, Polly. And our third speaker is Larry Palmer. Larry lived in Lowell House. After graduating from Yale Law School, he clerked for a federal judge and worked briefly for a law firm. There then followed some 40 years of teaching, scholarship, and university administration, 27 of them as a tenured professor at Cornell Law School, and then as vice president of the whole university, focusing on undergraduate education. Larry is a leading authority on health policy and law and has published 2 books on the subject. Since retirement some 10 years ago, he's continued to serve on many boards, most personally significant for Longwood University and the Presbyterian Church. Larry also managed to spend 4 to 5 hours a day writing a book-length memoir recently published by our classmate, Paul Dry, and widely available on Amazon and elsewhere. The book is called Scholarship Boy, Meditations on Family and Race. It focuses on Larry's pre-Harvard days at Phillips Exeter Academy as the 9th child in an African-American family. Larry has entitled today's talk, The 75-Year-Old Teaching Assistant. Larry?
The first inkling that I would someday write a memoir occurred during my usual pre-breakfast walk a few days before Reed, my third son, was born. That was back in June 1982, when my memory began taking me back in time to the summer of 1963 that I had spent in the South End of Boston working for a civil rights organization, to times with my siblings and even people I had known in college but thought I had forgotten. Before going to bed that night, I wrote feverishly about those memories in a notebook. The first entry outlined what I called an autobiographical novel. The word memoir was not yet part of my own lexicon. I envisioned the first chapter opening with my experience hearing Martin Luther King Jr. "I Have a Dream" speech at the March on Washington, and continuing with my reflections about the summer of 1963, the first summer I was away from home. The first attempt to move from scholarly writing to telling stories about my life began a year later in an August 1983 sermon, "Friends I Haven't Met Yet," a meditative reflection on my racial experience. Over the next decade, as I assumed greater administrative responsibilities, I continued to keep a journal. My scholarly output began to shift toward personal essays. I eventually wrote 2 books about law and medicine, primarily for non-legal audiences. As I became more enmeshed in the interdisciplinary fabric of Cornell, I found my writing reflected the influence of organizational change literature and the humanities. By the end of my term as vice president in 1994, I had collaborated with colleagues in our theater arts department and media services to produce a prize-winning educational video on the Tuskegee syphilis study in Negro men. I contributed an essay, Writing Law, to an anthology on writing in various disciplines before my second book was published in 2000. Even when I was involved in scholarly writing about ethical issues such as artificial reproduction, I always read a great deal of fiction. I continued to dip my pen into nonfiction writing over the years in occasional op-ed pieces and essays. I published an essay, Checkerboard Segregation in the 1950s, in 2009, as Barack Obama was inaugurated the 44th President of the United States. This piece provides the background to how an extraordinary teacher helped me attain a scholarship to attend Phillips Exeter Academy. What that essay leaves out is the role my siblings played, not only in supporting educational endeavors that allowed me to have a multifaceted professional career, but also in shaping the human being I have become. That's the story Scholarship Boy portrays. I retired for the 3rd time in 2011. Susie, my wife, became head of the library at Longwood University in Farmville, Virginia, which is 65 miles from Richmond. Over the next 5 years, we spent our weeks in Farmville and our weekends at our condo in Richmond. This provided me with the solitude and thus the inner space to devote all of my energies to discovering the truths of my life. As I approached the idea of writing a memoir after 40 years as some kind of academic, I recognized my limitations in terms of knowledge and skills to navigate the publishing world of literary nonfiction. I've always had a knack for following the advice of Mr. Rogers, which is to look for the helpers. As a friend and a long-time literary editor I met in Richmond recommended that I apply to the Kenyon Review Writers Workshop. That is also why I took the advice of Rebecca McClellan, my instructor at my first workshop at Kenyon in 2013. In my individual session with her, she told me to put the draft I had labored on for 2 years in the trash and start to work on excerpts that might turn into published pieces. She made the judgment not from reading what I thought of as a first draft of my book, but rather from listening during the week-long workshop to the short pieces I wrote each day in response to her prompts. As she said to me, "Larry, get that boy on the train. There's a story that might interest readers of literary journals and magazines. Forget about the book for the moment." The 3-minute piece I selected to read at Kenyon that summer grew into the published piece, The Haircut. It was nominated for a Pushcart Award prize. Incidentally, The Haircut became the basis of the first chapter of my memoir. Another published excerpt about one of my older brothers became the basis of another chapter in the book. Both essays were cited as notable essays in Best American Essays in 2015 and 2017. To remind you and me how humbling a venture into new fields and endeavors can be, let me tell you that a third excerpt, Dancing with My Sister, never was accepted by any literary journal prior to the publication of my memoir. Why? I don't know. I returned to Kenyon for another nonfiction workshop with a different instructor in 2014. I had seedlings for several other chapters by the time I got home. By the summer of 2016, I started looking for an agent or a publisher. I will spare you the details of the ordeal of trying to sell a manuscript that hadn't been solicited by either an agent or publisher. I signed a contract with Paul Dry Books in January 2019 with a spring 2020 publication date. After Rebecca had read The Galleys in December 2019 of my book, she invited me to be her Peter Taylor Fellow for the 2020 workshop. I eagerly accepted. Reed, now a nearly 40-year-old admissions officer at Cornell, asked me, then 75 years old, "What does a fellow do?" I told him each workshop has one instructor, one fellow, and 11 writers who paid the fees for the workshop. Before each morning's meeting of the workshops, the writer and the fellows complete a short written assignment that they read in the workshop. The major difference between a fellow and other participants is how each spends the unscheduled time in the afternoons. The writers might work on the next day's assignment, exercise, rest, or engage in conversations with members of their own workshop, other participants in other workshops, nonfiction, fiction, or poetry. Fellows, on the other hand, would have to arrange individual meetings with workshop members as directed by the instructor. Most of those meetings involve preparation for the members' evening 3-minute readings from work produced in the workshop. I admit I got a little excited when I explained that as a fellow, my 10-minute reading would be from my published work. I'd get to read from Scholarship Boy. In a more matter-of-fact tone, I explained that the fellows are like assistant instructors and the instructor's understudy. The fellow and the instructor consult on the assignments before arriving at Kenyon so that the fellow could take over the workshop in case the instructor became unable to continue for any reason. Reed interrupted me in his teasing voice. "Dad, aren't you a little old to be a TA?" I smiled without answering his question and mentioned that as a fellow, I got a full scholarship that covered my fees for the workshop and all my meals and room, and I would receive a small stipend. But his question made me think, what is it about me that led me to try to be a literary nonfiction writer over the past 10 years? The 2020 summer workshops were postponed because of COVID-19 until 2021 and reformatted into a week-long online workshop with the same teams of instructors and fellows. So I'm going back to the Kenyon Writers Review workshop virtually next month, but this time as a fellow. I suppose my answer to Reed's question at the time might have been, it's okay for me to be a 75-year-old teaching assistant as long as I have enough confidence to say, I don't know, and can still learn from mentors regardless of their age. I won't be teaching these aspiring writers. I will be collaborating with all the workshop participants and discovering the most effective ways for each of us to tell our individual human stories. I admit I still feel a little pride that the workshop's website describes me as an emerging writer. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Our fourth speaker is Wendy Coppage Sanford. Wendy lived in South House, and she majored in English. I should have known that. Shortly after graduation, she discovered feminism and helped found the Boston Women's Health Book Collective, a group of 12 women. Together, they wrote the classic Our Bodies, Ourselves, which has sold more than 4 million copies, been translated and adapted by women's groups around the world, and is available in 33 languages. In addition to writing, editing, and publishing a number of other books, Wendy obtained a master's in theological studies from the Harvard Divinity School, and for many years was a campus minister at Suffolk University. An active Quaker, Wendy lives in Cambridge with Polly Atwood, her spouse of 41 years. Due out this October is a memoir Wendy has worked and reworked for 30 years entitled These Walls Between Us, a memoir of friendship across race and class. Wendy has entitled today's talk, These Walls Between Us. Wendy?
Hi, thank you, Charlie.
Yeah.
I would like to explore some connections between my work on Our Bodies, Ourselves, which Charlie has so kindly described, and my new memoir, 30 Years in the Making, as he said, which will be published by She Writes Press this October. And I am calling it These Walls Between Us, a memoir of friendship across race and class. Shortly after we graduated from Radcliffe and Harvard, all of us, perhaps even earlier for some of you, feminism arrived among us. Feminism challenged me to develop a new perspective on some familiar scenes and relationships. For instance, what happened in my bedroom, what happened in the kitchen, and to see it through a new lens. I had to learn new words like sexism, patriarchy, liberation, power, as well as words for my own sexuality that I had never heard said out loud before. These were keys to a freedom I hadn't known I needed. I think of myself as I was then, a traditionally raised, upper middle class Protestant white woman whose Republican family depended on the New York Herald Tribune for news. The new vocabulary of feminism, political, social, personal, was unfamiliar and awkward for me. I remember on my way to becoming a women's health activist and a sex educator, I remember standing in my bathroom in front of the mirror, saying out loud words like clitoris, masturbation, orgasm, so I could say them in public without blushing. I also remember the moment with my husband, my then husband, when I first spoke the words as a feminist in conversation with him. And I remember his silence. New Words bookstore, a feminist bookstore that opened in Cambridge around that time, had it right. We were learning new words for our lives, and the transitions were not always easy or comfortable. Even the word we underwent a transition in my life. My feminist women's group, the Boston Women's Health Book Collective, assumed early on that we as a group of white college-educated women could say we and mean all women in the world. We all have bodies, right? We were so excited by this new we. We are more alike than different, aren't we? Well, through feedback, challenge, and confrontation by women of color activists, particularly our colleagues in the National Black Women's Health Project, we soon understood that the health issues that seemed so pressing to us as white middle-class women were not necessarily the same as the ones that most affected the lives and the well-being of women of color and women in poverty. I'm thinking right now of issues like sterilization abuse and the shocking rate of mortality of Black mothers and babies, which goes on today, has not been corrected even today. So part of my spiritual, it was a spiritual education, but part of my political education happened right there. Women are as divided by race and class as we are united in being female. In fact, decades later, we would understand from the movement for trans liberation that we don't even all mean the same thing when we say a woman's body. These differences matter. Motivated to learn more about the wider we, I began to read almost exclusively works by African-American women and other women of color. Pulling their award-winning books down from the packed shelves of New Words bookstore, I began to make up for the limits of my education in Harvard's 1960s English department. I began to study racism. In becoming a feminist, I had looked at what took place in my kitchen and my bedroom with new eyes and new words. As I became more aware of racism, and this took a far longer time because I, as a white woman, am so privileged in so many ways by institutional racism, I began to bring a new perspective to some other familiar scenes, and I'm going to tell you about one of them. This is the scene that gave my new book its title. A summer rental by a beach on the Atlantic Ocean. My mother, tanned white skin, blonde hair, sits at a small square dining table in the dining area of a large, high-ceilinged, sunny living room overlooking the sea. She's eating a lunch of cucumber sandwiches just prepared for her by a young African-American woman named Mary Norman, who endures the isolation of this remote white enclave each summer in order to supplement her salary in the New Jersey County Correction System, where she works all year. The back of my mother's chair touches the wall that the dining area shares with the kitchen. In the kitchen, with her back to the same wall, Mary Norman sits at the end of a long trestle table eating her own lunch. Because no one else is in the house at this moment, the kitchen door, which is usually firmly shut, is open. The two women, back to back, are talking. I discovered this scene one day in the summer of when my first wedding took place, 1964, when I returned from errands and walked past the two sets of open windows. Only decades later, after a lot of learning, a lot of reading, and a slowly evolving friendship with Mary Norman, did I bring a new vocabulary to this remembered scene. The racist rules of domestic service, in which a Black domestic worker is not allowed to sit down in the presence of the white employer. The way white women used Black domestic workers as confidants, even called them friends, but did not treat them as equals. The ways my mother's wealth rested solidly on centuries of unpaid work by enslaved African Americans in the South, and even, quiet as it's kept, in the North. The ways that Mary Norman's opportunities to build financial security were being successfully and purposefully undermined by racist federal housing policies. Two women, back to back, talking. Who was free to say what? Why was each woman so lonely? And on the long deserted ocean beach just below the living room window, why was Mary Norman allowed out there only in the white uniform of service? Why did Mary and I, when we started to walk that beach and to talk and maybe to become friends with each other, why did we have to wait until nightfall to take our walks? Learning to ask these questions revealed for me the white supremacy that isn't the visible violence of extremists like the KKK, but the daily operations of a system that advantages people who are thought of as white over people of color at every turning. The friendship that Mary Norman and I have developed over 60 years is at the heart of my memoir, These Walls Between Us. Sometime in the 1980s, Mary suggested that we write a book about our friendship. We dreamed of going on Oprah together. She had just started her show at the time. I have based the book on Mary's and my conversations in person, on the phone, in letters, via email, and now most fruitfully by text. Mary has read and commented on every draft of the book. In it, I draw lessons from my often stumbling steps as a white woman towards seeing Mary more fully and being a more dependable friend. I draw on the research and insights of many of the African-American writers and scholars I did not encounter during our education at Harvard. Mary and I agree that we hope the book will be useful and illuminating for white readers. As Mary said one day, the people who elected Donald Trump say they want to go back to the old days. This book will show what those old days were really like. White privilege, white fragility, white supremacy. Whiteness as a salient and never neutral factor in our common life. As Marion Bennett's powerful talk yesterday, 2 days ago, suggested, these are very present realities to communities of color. Many white people are not so comfortable talking about it. Speaking the words is often awkward for me and maybe for other white members of our class. I'm learning to put these words and concepts to use as questions I ask myself, as ways of understanding the world. I invite those of you who are white to do the same. Using a more accurate language and heeding Black leaders who do so will help us name social ills that put our country in great danger. I believe we must continue to tackle those ills with all the energy and wisdom that we have left. Kim, could you show picture number 2 just so people can see the cover of my book? Thank you. If my story seems useful or illuminating to you, please remember it next October and ask your local independent bookstore to carry these walls between us. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. We'll remember it in October. I will. Our fifth and final speaker is Stephen Shafer. Stephen lived in Eliot House. After graduation, he went to Columbia University, where he earned an MD, MPH, and master's in geography. The next 40 years, Stephen practiced in many of Manhattan's inner city hospitals. Back as early as 1980, Stephen and his wife Elizabeth were weekenders keeping sheep on her family's farm some 90 miles north of New York City. In 1992, they moved to a 230-year-old farm nearby, still as weekenders, but this time having hired an expert manager. 10 years ago, Stephen retired as a clinical professor of neurology at Harlem Hospital Center. Ever since, he and Elizabeth have resided and worked full-time on the farm, cherishing what Wendell Berry calls the gift of the good land. At this stage of life, it is the soil that Stephen wishes to talk about in wonder, praise, and growing apprehension. He has entitled his talk, Soil Appreciation 101. Stephen?
Thank you, Charlie. It's a privilege to talk to classmates today. Thank you all for having me. Trigger warning. I'm going to crisis monger about a question that probably most of you have never thought about. It threatens the world only slightly less than global overheating. But before you do a not again forehead slap and click leave, hear me say that this crisis, the wasting away of world soils, is not peculiar to this past 100 years. And it has a practical, low-tech, available solution. In the creation story of the Abrahamic religions, the first human was created from clay or dust or earth, all of which are soil. soil dryly defined as the organic and mineral matter of the most superficial part of the earth, which is the medium for the natural growth of all living plants, all land plants. We're sons and daughters of the soil. Most everything we eat comes directly or indirectly from soil through photosynthesis. All land-based life depends on soil, the lives in it, and its interactions with air and water. We live on the surface of a rock, sustained by its soft skin of soil, grown over 400 million years from an initial depth of 0 to one that is infinitesimal, yet has supported life on Earth for all that time. The uppermost 16 inches of this, the topsoil that nourishes nearly all food and forage, has the same ratio to our planet's radius as the thickness of 2 sheets of paper to the height of the Empire State Building, spire included. That's not much to grow on, but it's enough. As the human population gets larger and big domestic animals out-eat big wild animals, the soil to feed the world is losing fertility and volumetrically decreasing on our watch. With scant notice indeed. In the hierarchy of environmental crises, soil is the poor relation. Everybody here knows all too well that the world's air is polluted with particulates and the world's atmosphere with greenhouse gases that cause global overheating. Everybody knows that fresh water is in too many places contaminated by lead, arsenic, PFAS, nitrates, etc. And that oceans with their marine life suffer from acidification, rising temperatures, algal blooms, microplastic waste, and macroplastic waste, to name a few. Everybody knows that fire, the third of the classical elements, scourges the Amazon basin and drought-prone regions of the world more every year. What about earth, the fourth of the classical elements? How many in this informed group realize that the mechanized deep plowing practices of the last 100 years have made rates of soil disappearance, erosion by wind and water, 5 to 10 times greater than rates of formation? How many realize that at current pace, the US is losing 2 billion tons of soil each year, twice as much as was blown off in the worst years of the Dust Bowl? Or that in the US Corn Belt, a third of the farmland has entirely lost its carbon-rich, fertile topsoil? How many realize, how many wonder what this means for food security in the next 50 years? This is a pretty rough round of rhetorical questions, so I'll settle down with the broadest one, food security. An official of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization shocked the food and ag sphere in 2014 by saying the world has only 60 harvests left. The warning must have been based on an ultra worst case scenario, counterfactually assuming all soils worldwide to be the same type, of the same shallow depth, in the same region, with the same topography and the same usually bad management as the most rapidly eroding minority. The claim was exaggerated, but it is fair warning. A meme for it is in the first photo image. 50 years of erosion in the Palouse, the bountiful wheatlands of eastern Washington you see behind me, have removed 5 feet of soil from this little rise. Slide off, please. Erosion is not the only force compromising soil health. In situ degradation, also related to deep plowing and bad grazing, threatens equally. Soil with no or scant vegetation quickly surrenders life-enhancing carbon to the air as CO2. Carbon emissions due to cultivations since 1850 have been about a third as much as those due to fossil fuel combustion. As its carbon content falls, soil gets less fertile, requiring imported inputs to keep up yields. Bird shit was succeeded by synthesized fertilizers like ammonium nitrate. No matter how carefully applied, some of that inorganic nitrogen ends up as a water pollutant or a significant greenhouse gas, nitrous oxide. Being stripped of carbon and addicted to factory-made nitrogen is only one way soil is degraded without physically moving. It is the most prevalent. The second photo image, the painting Worn Out by the Danish painter H.A. Brendekilde, is an apt illustration of soil death in place. The parallel processes of soil erosion and carbon deprivation will soon collide with growing human population to make inequalities of food and water supply worse worldwide than they are now. That's the bad news. Now the good, and it is good. Slide off, please. Ongoing harm to soils can be reversed in ways that are much closer to hand than other climate-related objectives, like reducing CO2 emissions 50% in the next 10 years. We can change methods of crop cultivation and cattle raising to what's termed regenerative agriculture. The hallmarks of regen ag are reduced tillage and roots living in soil year-round. That pairing stores long-term in soil some of the carbon that photosynthesis by plants has put into roots as CO2 from the air. This carbon sequestration bolsters soil health and lowers atmospheric CO2 content, creating oxymoronic negative emissions. Negative emissions are key to countering global heat up. Sequestering carbon in agricultural soils is low tech and much cheaper than the main alternative, direct air capture of CO2. However, all-out deployment of regenerative ag will not create enough negative emissions to halt climate breakdown. It is a wedge that can help, and it will save the Earth's soils from being worn out in a few more generations. The best way for farmers or non-farmers to push the win-win strategy of regenerative agriculture is to support policy and legislation that empower it. Especially needed are measures that offer farmers and ranchers fiscal assistance in the bumpy transition from conventional practices to regenerative. The near certainty of early losses in this switchover is a barrier to needed change. Money or credit from outside can give activation energy. The early setbacks, happily, are followed without exception for those who stay the course by a better bottom line, better soils, and better ecosystem services like water handling and biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.